Welcome to the session that is going to discuss the evolution and concepts of education for sustainable development. Allow me to remove the mask and continue. So, I start by reminding ourselves about the overall background of our relationship with nature, the relationship between man and the world. We started from a time when man was an integral part of nature, totally emerged in nature. But very, very early, with the start of the civilization, he started using some tools, instruments from stone, later on from copper. So he started his technology. He started also at the same time the painting, also the language, communication with others, so a culture, and also asking himself from where I come, where I go, who has created all this. So the spiritual the spiritual questions. So these are three dimensions of the environment. The natural environment, but also three dimensions that he created in his intellect and his contacts with nature. The technological, the cultural, and the spiritual. These, throughout centuries and millennia, became bigger and bigger. And today, these dominate, actually, the natural environment, which was always, is still always as it was. So it became small, let's say, in comparison with what the man-made environment is today. So the man-made environment, natural, spiritual, technological, cultural, is what we call anthroposphere. And this has to be compared with the natural environment, the geosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. Of course, man is part of the biosphere, but this is a particular species that has created all the anthroposphere. This, let's say, imbalance between anthroposphere and the natural environment has actually created the problems we have today with the environment and the lack, or rather the pressures, the big pressures on natural resources. Here I would like to say that our position vis-à-vis the environment is always guided by a combination of different types of attitudes. Starting from the self-interest, I mean, I want to protect the environment because I don't want to be poisoned myself or my children, or because I have the understanding that water resources, for example, are a common good. So they have a social good, a welfare for the society, part of which I am. Finally, it has an intrinsic value, the environment, that many people understand and respect and admire as part of the creation or evolution or whatever you wish to call what is beyond humans and human capacities. Already in the 60s and 70s, we started approaching the first steps of environmental education, as we used to call it, as an alternative approach, not only to the environment, but also as an alternative approach to education itself, bringing students in the center and respecting more or less not only the general ideas about science, but specific the chemical cycles in nature, understanding how the biogeochemical cycles affect the society. So this was the starting point of education, environmental education, which very soon were supported by a theoretical background, because in the late 60s and early 70s, 71, 72, we had the publication of the Limits to Growth ordered by the Club of Rome to the MIT University. And following that, we had the big conference, the first big conference of Stockholm for the Human Environment, 72. In that, we had a clear reference to education, environmental education, as a major tool for the protection of the environment. So it was an education with a purpose. This was further elaborated in 75 in Belgrade and in Tbilisi in 77 in the very first intergovernmental conference on environmental education. In all this, we had the introduction of environmental education as a major tool for the protection of the environment. Of course, from the very beginning, there was a link between environment and development, but the link was not so visible, and at the same time, having as the environmental protection a single prerequisite for the later on development. In fact, the major idea was, and visualization, was of an Earth as a spacecraft where the human over all human anthroposphere that I mentioned before, human over structure, is based on the resources of the environment, and therefore the concept was that by preserving the environment, we support the overstructure, the human overstructure. Already 10 years after that, we have the first revision in Moscow of the environmental education. And actually, I had the task at that time as a very young, academic, to prepare the international, a report, one of the 4 reports, on the international comprehension and problems of contemporary environment, the role of environmental education. We wanted, through education, to cover, actually, the request for an education supporting international understanding and peace, which was very early, perhaps, at the time. At the same time, we have realized that something is coming, and that was the report published exactly at that time, a few months later, which was the Limits to Growth report. The Limits to Growth report brought us to Rio in 1992, the Rio conference the first that introduced the concept of sustainable development. And in chapter 36 of the Agenda 21, we have a very thorough examination of what is needed as education. It was not called at that time education for sustainable development yet, but education that was going to support sustainable development.